Hello and welcome to the LMG Security On Demand webinar. Today's presenters are Sherri Davidoff and Matt Durring. Sherri Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and is the author of 3 books, including Data Breaches. She is a certified penetration tester and forensic analyst and a graduate of MIT. Sherri has been called a, quote, security badass by the New York Times. Matt Durring is the Director of Training and Research at LMG Security and a Black Hat USA instructor. He holds his computer science degree from the University of Montana, and his malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. Matt and Sherri are co-authors of the new book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion, Response and Prevention.
Thank you so much and welcome everybody. Pleasure to see you all again. Over the past few years, we have done a recap of the top threats for each year, and it's interesting to see how the hackers are building upon the tools and techniques that they've leveraged in the past, and they're just taking it to the next level. This year is no exception. We're going to talk about technology supply chain attacks, how hackers are targeting technology vendors, including software providers, third-party service providers, and they're using that as a vector to get into all of our organizations. Next, we'll discuss software API abuse, how hackers are leveraging that glue that keeps our technology infrastructure together. It often doesn't make the headlines, but it's an increasingly important systemic issue. We'll then discuss identity abuse, how hackers are leveraging access to identities and targeting people, also targeting service accounts, using that to take over environments. Evil Matt will show us how he hacked into a network in LMG's laboratory and uses access to a low-level person's account in order to eventually take over the domain controller and the entire environment. So we'll actually see a case study and a demonstration on that today. Then we'll discuss multi-factor authentication flaws and bypass attacks. Unfortunately, normal multi-factor authentication is not enough. You have to really be thinking about what kind of MFA you're deploying. So we'll discuss that. And finally, we'll wrap up by talking about rookie hackers and how they have access to military-grade cyber weapons these days that make it very, very easy for more people to hack you. And finally, we're going to conclude by talking about the 9 ways that you can protect yourself and your organization. All right, so let's dig into our first top threat. Hackers have been targeting the software supply chain, the technology supply chain. We saw that with SolarWinds, we saw that with Log4j, and often they're going after tools that are used massively around the world, but are maybe not widely known. Again, Log4j is a really great example of that. Because of this, according to Sonatype, we've seen an increase of 742% in supply chain attacks. Gartner has been predicting that by 2025, 45% of organizations will report experiencing attacks on their software supply chains, which is an increase of 3 times since 2021. And Matt, I don't know about you, I thought this was funny because I was like 45%, we're seeing attacks on hosted exchange servers alone, which affect a much higher percentage of organizations than that. What are your thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing when we see suppliers get hit by these kind of attacks is that they are responsible for providing services to a lot of other organizations. So the stats that we get on this are a little misleading. When we talk about someone like Rackspace who has been impacted, they may have only had, a couple thousand of their customers impacted, which I'll let you get into in a second. But that means those customers also have impacts farther down the chain. Really, really bad way of going about running into a cybersecurity incident.
Yeah, Rackspace really is a great example. So they were hit with a ransomware attack in early December 2022. And the reason we're showcasing this is because it was due to a vulnerability in their hosted exchange platform. Now, as a result of this, tens of thousands of customers lost access to their email. In fact, I haven't heard confirmation that that's ever been brought back up. In fact, instead, they're going to be moving customers over to the Office 365 platform. But the bottom line is we're not just concerned about that third-party supplier, Rackspace. You also have to be worried about vulnerabilities in their supplier as well of the software that they're using. So really good case study. But Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the vulnerabilities that the hackers exploited in order to deploy this ransomware?
Sure. So based on information that Rackspace has released, it looks like they were impacted by a vulnerability inside of their exchange system called proxy not shell. And if you remember back to last year, there was a series of exploits called proxy shell that were released for the Microsoft Exchange system. They were massively impactful. Tens of thousands of organizations around the world were affected by this. And this is kind of an offshoot of that. Now, calling it a 0-day is a little bit of a misnomer. This has actually been patched by Microsoft for quite some time now. And it looks like the issue on Rackspace's end was due to some miscommunications or not understanding the full scope of this vulnerability. They were not fully patched against it. So I don't know. I have a hard time calling it a 0-day. It just seems like this is more of a patch management issue, but it was no less impactful.
This really goes to show you how everybody is deciding what to prioritize. No organization can fix all of the vulnerabilities that they know about, Microsoft included, right? And so clearly Rackspace deprioritized this because they didn't realize it was as critical as it was. And that communication matters, and the resources that your third-party providers have matters as well. They're not perfect. So there are pros and cons to hosting with third-party providers. On the one hand, you want your third party to handle the configuration of your Microsoft products or your other products that you're using, but that doesn't mean that you have no risk. So when I talk about third-party providers, we mean this is someone who's not you, but may also not be the manufacturer of the product. So they have to really get up to speed on the best practices. They have to make sure that they're aware of the latest vulnerabilities, that they're deploying any patches that are available. That is a distinct difference between that and hosting directly with Microsoft, because they have the opportunity to decide that they're going to immediately deploy patches in a consistent manner across their whole landscape of customers that are using their systems. So we do tend to see with software hosted by third parties that it might be behind on patches. It can lead to business email compromise. Sometimes they're set up very quickly in order to get you up and running, and they're not paying as much attention to security. Matt, do you want to maybe share a little background? I know you've handled a ton of cases that are hosted with third-party providers where it just wasn't fully configured the way it could have been.
Of course, and it's unfortunate, but we do run into this fairly frequently when we're talking about systems, including Office 365, that are hosted or resold by third-party vendors. So Rackspace and GoDaddy are two really good examples of this. We find that they don't oftentimes have all of the normal security features available or enabled that you would expect to find inside those tenants. Audit logging is a big one for Microsoft's Office 365 system. We've run into more than one business email compromise case where the victim is hosting their email service through a third-party provider, and that provider does not have what we would refer to as best practice elements available on that system. So we don't have good logging, we don't have good accountability inside the system, and it leads to a lot of potentially over-reporting if we can't rule out potential for information being stolen or something else along those lines. So even if you are hosting with a third party, make sure that you understand exactly what kind of security features you're going to have access to, whether you have custom dashboards for your software, and if there are any additional steps you need to take to really kind of shore up your security posture.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And it's interesting with Rackspace, they just decided they're not going to provide hosted exchange anymore for exactly these reasons. It's a lot of work and a lot of risk. So instead, all of their customers, they're migrating them for free, of course, to Microsoft's own platform, which makes sense. So it may seem to you all that there have been more and more vulnerabilities getting exploited over the past few years, and that is not a surprise. One of the reasons we're seeing this is because over the past decade or two, hackers have stolen a ton of source code. Now, why does this lead to more vulnerabilities? Well, once hackers have their hands on that sweet, juicy source code, they can easily comb it for vulnerabilities. They can see how it's built. They can tear it apart. And then once they find those vulnerabilities, they can quickly write software exploits for them. So we're starting to see software exploits flooding the market. Also, we didn't used to see tech companies reporting break-ins as often, particularly when it was just source code or just intellectual property that was stolen. There are not the same laws governing tech companies when they get hacked as there are if your social security number gets stolen or your driver's license gets stolen. And as a result of that, we've seen signs over the past decade that tech companies have been hacked, but they don't always report it. For example, Microsoft, we found out in 2017, Microsoft was hacked 4 years earlier in 2013, and hackers got access to their bug tracking database. Think about that. Why would they want that? Well, they want to know what vulnerabilities are out there that Microsoft hasn't patched yet. So the hackers are going after those bugs. Nobody knows about it. It increases systemic risk for everybody. The only reason we know now is because a former Microsoft employee who left eventually talked to the media. And you can see the article on the slide. So we're starting to see software suppliers actually reporting this. LastPass reported that they were hacked and source code was stolen. Okta reported that they were hacked. GitHub had a similar issue, and hackers are targeting those code repositories, bug tracking databases, researchers, folks like that. It increases the systemic risk for all of us. And what are they doing when they write those exploits? Well, there's a market for it. They're not always keeping them for themselves. In fact, a lot of times they're peddling them on the dark web. So what you're seeing here is a fresh screenshot from one of our favorite sites, 0 Day Today, where you can actually go through and buy 0-day vulnerabilities, typically for anywhere between $1,000 to $10,000 a pop. Hackers are also then using those exploits in the wild. So for example, there was recently a vulnerability in a Fortinet perimeter device, and we see this a lot with perimeter devices. And Mandiant's researchers discovered in the wild that Chinese threat actors were exploiting it just a few weeks later. And again, this matches what we're seeing, where there's a fairly short window of time between when a vulnerability is discovered and announced, and then when it's actually being exploited. In fact, sometimes those are flipped, and we see the exploits first, and then the vendor is notified about it. But this is a chart from Microsoft's Digital Defense Report. Really great read. There's a link on the slide. I highly recommend it. You can see when a vulnerability is publicly disclosed, the risk of exploitation goes up very, very quickly. The vertical axis here is risk, and you can see it increasing. Within 14 days, we see it hitting a peak where all of a sudden there's exploitation in the wild on a regular basis. And then that just goes up and up and up. Proof of concept code is released at approximately 60 days. And by 120 days, you're seeing those exploits incorporated into available scanning tools. Obviously, this timeline can be compressed for very high profile vulnerabilities or extended for things that people don't worry about as much. But this is a typical speed and scale of the vulnerability commoditization. Interesting developments with respect to ChatGPT. Researchers have been experimenting and have found that using AI, and by building AI into malware, they can bypass some endpoint protection and antivirus filters and have it create polymorphic malware on the fly. So imagine that you're not actually distributing malware, you're distributing a package that can be instructed to create malware instead. So this is still in its infancy. It's still a very nascent type of malware development, but just some warning signs that we may see more polymorphic and evasive malware in the future. All right, and Matt, I know we were talking earlier about the leaking of Samsung's source code and how that has led to theft of secret keys. Do you want to dig into that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So in addition to vulnerabilities in source code that attackers are able to identify and then weaponize and exploit, further on down the road, there are other elements of that source code and code repositories that can be really valuable for a cyber criminal. And a couple of those elements are going to be things like the signing keys that applications use to actually verify themselves inside your computer system. As Sherri mentioned, we saw this with the Samsung source code leak that happened back in March of 2022. And we are now starting to see mobile malware, Android-based malware that is coming out that's being signed with trusted keys from that source code. This means that antivirus software or security tools may still allow that software to run because it looks like it's coming from a trusted vendor. And this isn't the first time we've seen this. We saw after the NVIDIA source code leak, thanks to the Lapsus group, ironically the same group that was responsible for leaking Samsung's code, they were able to steal these signing keys from NVIDIA. And we very quickly, after this source code was released, started seeing malware pop up on places like VirusTotal with those signing certificates in place. The example you see on the screen here is a Mimikatz binary that we found on VirusTotal that has an NVIDIA signature at the bottom of it. And NVIDIA, if you're not familiar with them, is responsible for a lot of graphics and video hardware inside most computer systems. So there's a really good chance they're not going to be restricted from running inside of a lot of networks. And so if malware is signed with their own signature, that's going to be able to run as well. It's a very dangerous situation to find ourselves in.
Yeah, this is really impacting the effectiveness of endpoint protection, because as more and more of this code signing keys are out there, you have malware that will just fly by antivirus software and EDR systems because it's properly signed, and therefore the endpoint trusts it. So Matt, I think that this is a really great example of NVIDIA software drivers are used all over the world. And unfortunately, this really was a national security disaster. So what can we do about this? It is so critically important to monitor and patch your attack surface. And when I say monitor, I don't mean do monthly vulnerability scans. That kind of was the standard practice 5-6 years ago. No longer the case. You really need to be doing continuous attack surface monitoring, continuous vulnerability scanning. If you're wondering what that means, I would do at least daily, if not weekly, scans of your perimeter, your internet-facing perimeter, and then set an appropriate time frame for your internal infrastructure as well. If you're wondering what to prioritize, CISA has a list out. You can see the link here. These are vulnerabilities that they are seeing actively exploited in the wild. So you might want to prioritize those, make sure you're actively checking for them and that everything is correctly patched and verified. And also conduct penetration testing. Penetration testing is great for detecting things that automated scans won't detect. So have actual humans laying hands on your network, figuring out how to bypass any endpoint protection that you have and see how easy it is. And that lets you get to the root of these issues and really understand how is a hacker going to break in so that you can fix those problems before they do. Also helps you prioritize your investments, which I think is key. Nobody has unlimited resources. All right, let's dig into our second top threat of 2023. Really, it's related: software API abuse. Interconnected systems are so important, and we have seen software APIs becoming a critical part of that glue that keeps our technology infrastructure together. But what happens if an API has a vulnerability or a weakness, or if it can be misused by hackers? Well, we're seeing that occur on a regular basis. According to Reversing Labs, they're predicting that we're going to see attacks on software supply chains in general increase. And then in the chart you're seeing here, this shows you the different APIs that are getting abused, right, Matt? I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of these top APIs that are being manipulated.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And if you look at the list of services that we have on this chart in front of you, you can see exactly how impactful these kind of attacks can be. If someone is able to gain access to an API key, there's a good chance they can interact with those systems as if they were a trusted application, meaning they have access to, well, an untold amount of data inside those repositories. And the top ones on the list you can see are Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services, where a lot of organizations store data long-term. We're talking about things like S3 buckets that are now potentially vulnerable to intrusion based on the loss of this key. So something we really want to watch out for. There are other ways that these tokens and keys can be used to abuse you as well, and we've seen a rash of these newer kind of phishing attacks out called consent phishing attacks. These rely on OAuth keys and API keys. What the difference between this and a standard phishing attack, whereas a standard phishing attack is going to try to steal your username and password, these attacks are trying to get you to authorize an application to interact with your online services. And we see Microsoft targeted very frequently in these kind of attacks. Once an attacker has access to your inbox or your SharePoint or whatever else with that API key, they can oftentimes survive things like password resets. They can bypass multi-factor authentication, and they can honestly be very hard to identify as being still in the system. It can lead to a very long dwell time and a large potential for information to be stolen from organizations based on what is realistically a pretty simplistic kind of attack.
Microsoft's applications are so widely used, it's not surprising that they're also very widely hacked. And this chart really shows you the distribution of attacks on different Microsoft products. So you can see how SharePoint, OneDrive, and other products are highly targeted. Google Drive is also targeted, but at a much lower rate than Microsoft applications. So how can you protect against these types of attacks? Well, first of all, it's very important to conduct cloud configuration reviews. Often simple little changes to your cloud configuration can protect you from being the next Capital One, for example. So make sure that you're doing an inventory of your cloud apps, your cloud data, so that you can use that information to prioritize. Any place where you have highly sensitive information or where it's very critical for your operations, you want to prioritize those, do at least an annual configuration review, and then making sure you're keeping up to date on any changes throughout the year. Remember, if you don't make any changes, the security profile decays, right? Because threats are constantly emerging, new features are coming out, attackers are moving forward, they're finding ways to bypass the protections that we've had in place. So security decays, and you really have to put work and effort into keeping up with it and making sure you're properly configuring it. And if you need help with that, that is something that our team does. So you can always call LMG for assistance there. Okay, I know, Matt, we've been talking a lot about how malicious code is embedded in open source software, which is often then used by commercial vendors as well, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. And the elements that you see on the screen in front of you here are a perfect example of where we find these vulnerable dependencies and software packages. PyPy, NPM, and Ruby gems may not be names that are very familiar to you on the surface level. And if you're not a software developer, that's completely understandable. But attackers are actively targeting these kind of repositories for either exploitation of something that's already vulnerable or basically inserting their own malicious code into these packages. And these are used in thousands of software applications all around the world. Odds are good you're probably using something right now that is using dependencies from one of these libraries, and you may not even know it. It's why things like a software bill of materials become so important, and it becomes a great indicator as to why we need to be able to trust our software supply chain and identify when something has gone wrong with it.
Well, I love that you mentioned the software bill of materials, because of course that was part of the White House's executive order last year, that we expect to see companies coming out with essentially a list of ingredients for their software. So stay tuned. We expect to see that more and more widely used in order to understand exactly what's in the software you use, what's in the technology products, and then what your level of risk is. You may also be wondering, what is the government doing for me today? Well, just this fall on Halloween, we saw a multi-agency effort to produce guidance for suppliers. And I think this is actually really important. It didn't get nearly as much press as I had hoped. First of all, they defined what a supplier is. A supplier is an organization that acts as a liaison or an intermediary between the developer and the customer. So it's that middleman that's helping you deploy things like Rackspace. And then it defines responsibilities for the supplier, maintaining the integrity of securely delivered software, validating software packages and updates, maintaining awareness of vulnerabilities. These are some things that often suppliers say, well, that's not my problem. And now everybody's on the same page, or hopefully will be soon. And then finally, accept customer reports of issues or newly discovered vulnerabilities and notifying the developers. So that is also part of our supplier's role as well. So I think it's really helpful that this has now been defined. These responsibilities have been allocated. Again, if you're interested, I highly recommend reading this report. It's very well thought through. We're also seeing some legislative action. Just in December, we saw a bill come out of the Senate for securing open source software. Matt, I know you're very, very excited about this.
I am, and I think one of the really neat things about this new kind of legislation is that it very closely mirrors the types of improvements that the government looked to put forward after we saw the dark side attack on Colonial Pipeline about a year or so ago. And one of the big things that they're trying to do with this type of legislation is kind of break down that barrier between private industry and the federal government. This is going to be done for purposes of information sharing, for strategy, for a lot of other really important things that help us as the defenders of these networks understand exactly what a threat landscape or what the threat landscape looks like, what the standard tactics that attackers are using are being leveraged for, and a lot more. I won't go through and read off every bullet because there's a lot of them in there, but needless to say, there are some great moves forward in information sharing that I think we'll start to see some big benefit from.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if this goes through. I do think we've seen some bipartisan support for cybersecurity legislation, so we may well see this being passed into law. All right, what can we do? Sometimes these types of attacks seem very overwhelming. The risks seem like things that we don't have direct control over. But what you do have direct control over is who you select to be your supplier and what software you decide to use. So it's a good idea to inventory your suppliers, including any technology vendors that you use, and make sure you vet them routinely. If you don't have time to vet all of them routinely, prioritize. And make sure you're prioritizing those vendors that are handling sensitive data for you or have access to your critical resources or are hosting critical systems. You want to make sure you assign responsibility for vetting. Have a standard questionnaire for your own sanity. You don't want to have something different from every vendor. Make sure you're tracking any issues, following up. And perhaps a really important foundational piece is that you're including cybersecurity in your contracts and letting them know that you're going to be doing regular checks. All right, our third threat is identity abuse. And I should mention, we have as a handout the top security controls of 2023. Identity and access management is not only on that list, it was the #1 top control that we picked for the first quarter here. Why? Because attackers are targeting your identity. And not just the identity of your users, but also applications and services that we trust to execute actions on our behalf. So in a moment, I'll turn it over to Matt so he can actually walk through a case study in our lab and show us how he became Evil Matt, the hacker, and took over a network, starting with a low-level user, using her identity, and then working his way up to domain administrator. So Matt, why don't you take it away?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you, Sherri. Yeah, so one of the big things that we want to talk about when we're going over the threats that come from identity abuse are the loss of the things that help you verify your identity. And one of the most common that all of us tend to use are credentials. Why is this a problem? Well, because credentials get stolen frequently. This is a report from the Register stating that there are about 24.6 billion pairs of credentials for sale on the dark web. And honestly, I think that number is probably a little low. There's probably more than that. But the Digital Shadows research team, I had to throw this quote in there just because it was too good. You still have a colleague, maybe more than one, who's carefully typing 1234556 into a password field right now. And 123456 is the #1 most common password we find in breach password lists out there on the dark web.
Oh,
This
Matt,
is
that is so
problem.
terrible to hear. But I bet it's usually saved in someone's browser and just autofilled. I just have to.
Oh yeah. Yeah, people aren't actually typing these in. They're being saved in something like Chrome, but as we'll show as we move through our scenario here, that is not necessarily the safest place to hold your passwords. So before we get into it, we should probably identify what identity and access management actually is, because in a lot of cases, this is a fairly new term for people who have been in the industry for a while. Identity and access management, or IAM, refers to basically how a computer system verifies who you are and what you're allowed to do. So we're looking at things like verification of your privilege level, what you can access, what you can modify, and who owns the account that you're looking at. When we're talking about your identity, this can be any number of things. So this is going to be things like a username and password. It could be an access key. It could be a device ID. There are a lot of different ways that we can look at this. Attackers are actively targeting these identity components because if they can take over your identity inside of a system, they have access to everything that you have access to, which means if they take over a higher level account, they can make their way through to the crown jewels of a network with a lot more ease than otherwise.
Yeah, and Matt,
yeah, go ahead, Sherri.
Yeah, I love that there is now like a single name for this, because it really is a collection of tools, right? Yeah. It's not like this suddenly appeared. We have authentication services. So you want to be using multi-factor authentication, authorization, who can access what files, things that are not like, on billboards in airports. This is not like the new hotness of technology. It's not the new shiny thing. It's literally going through and making sure the right people can access the right resources, and you can't access things that you don't need access to. So those are just a couple of the components of identity and access management. Again, it's not like it's all totally new. It's really just a collection of different tools like technologies that have been developed over the past decades.
Yeah, hugely important when it comes to your overall security profile. Mainly when it comes to the number of accounts that most users inside of a standard corporate network have access to. This is a study that was done by CyberArk. They were able to determine that in a small to medium business, we are looking at an average of 30 applications that staff members will have access to, usually with something like credentialed access. And that credentialed access is a massive point where attackers can jump in and overtake someone's identity. In fact, in the survey they did in the same CyberArk study, IT professionals responded that credentialed access, or the loss of credentialed access, is one of their biggest risks inside of their network. And it makes sense why that would be the case.
So let's dig into a case study. Some of you may already be familiar with HackMe Inc. Poor HackMe Inc. HackMe is a business network set up in LMG's laboratory. They sell very important widgets, so important. And they also, for some reason, collect a ton of PII and sensitive customer data, because apparently you need a lot of PII to make widgets. I don't know. Anyway, they're in there. They have a database administrator named Vic Tim, hello Vic, and also Layability, the finance clerk. So we will see how our hacker, Evil Matt, uses Leia's identity to, again, gain a foothold inside HackMe's network and then eventually take over. So again, we have two users here, a privileged database administrator and then a finance clerk that doesn't have any special privileges on the network. And then nice sunglasses, Evil Matt. Okay, so how'd you break in, Evil Matt?
Yeah, so we wanted to model this off of what we see in the wild as one of the most common ways that credentialed access gets stolen, and that was through the use of a phishing website. In this case, you can see the example we put up there. This is a notification to a user, which we see this as a very common tactic used by email phishers. letting them know that their Microsoft account is about to expire due to inactivity. And since most of us use our Microsoft accounts for a lot of things, we don't want that account to expire. Down at the bottom of the email, there's a link the user can click on where they can go and they can verify their password and continue to use their online services. What's happening here in reality, though, is someone is going to steal the credentials from this individual user and end up either using them or reselling them. So once we see credentials stolen, we usually see them pop up pretty quickly, either for sale on the dark web or on hacker forums. And we have a shot of one of those forums right here on the slide. This is a list of 644 million email addresses and passwords that are just being offered up in a uncompressed 14 gigabyte database that, in this case, pretty much anyone can download. We also have a similar network setup to how a lot of organizations are configured now, where we're using a single sign-on provider, meaning if our finance clerk's username and password for her Microsoft account are compromised, that can further compromise multiple other systems down the line in the network with just that one single set of credentials.
I just wanted to mention, we have seen credentials all over dark web markets, and it's just continuing to rise. A good example of that is Norton LifeLock just got hacked, and they are warning that hackers breach people's password manager accounts. So hackers are targeting your password vaults, your places where passwords are stored. And in some cases, they're manually grabbing them. In some cases, they actually have automated tools to suck passwords out of these systems.
Yeah. In a cruel bit of irony, too, the Norton LifeLock hack happened because of already stolen passwords. So you can see how these things kind of snowball.
Oh, that's awful. Breaches lead to more breaches. It's just
that is true.
So one thing that Hack Me Inc. could have done to prevent this is, of course, we want to make sure that liability is not clicking on links or opening attachments in phishing emails. So training is extremely important. I know we're already working with many of you out there on automating training, having on-demand training. If you don't already use on-demand training, it is an extremely good idea. It is no longer the case that you can do cybersecurity training once a year and just let it be. We have to make sure that cybersecurity is on the minds of our team members every single day. So according to KnowBe4, 38% of organizations are training monthly, and another 23% are actually training users twice a month. So that's really becoming the standard. And the nice thing about on-demand is that they can do it in little snippets, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. They can do it at times that are convenient for them. So that's part of why I personally am a big believer in on-demand training, very effective. And then you can supplement that with things like email reminders, training videos. Hello, thank you guys for being here and for doing your training. It's a good idea also to include phishing exercises so that liability gets regular practice. She knows what to look for. She knows not to click on links. And if she does, she's automatically sent for extra training. You also want to make sure that you're curating your training. Again, this is something we talk a lot about here at LMG, making sure that we're including things like multi-factor authentication, bypass attacks in the latest training. Whatever the threat actors are doing to target your end users, you have to make sure your end users are actually aware of that. So you want to have somebody who's familiar with the threat landscape guiding your training. According to IBM, if you have effective employee training, that will reduce your average cost of a data breach by over $247,000. So you can see some ROI there. And that's just the cost of a breach if it occurs. I'm sure in a lot of cases, the risk of a breach goes down as well because of training. All right, unfortunately, liability did fall for that phishing attack, and Evil Matt broke in. Evil Matt, tell us what you did once you stole her password.
Yeah, so once we had her username and password, we decided to start exploring how we could gain access to the Hack Me Inc. corporate network. Now, Hack Me Inc. is configured with an SSL VPN system, which allows for remote workers or offsite workers to access internal network resources. Very common, especially in today's technology world, to have a system set up like this. Now, in this case, the identity management for their VPN system was being run through Azure, and this is actually a very secure way of going about things. This means all the credentialed access is being handled through that single identity provider with multi-factor authentication enabled. Now we're getting to the point where we've seen where we see a lot of organizations relying very, very heavily on multi-factor, whereas a few years ago we saw it, sparingly. We're seeing it as an essential security control at this point, and that's a good thing. But it leads us to the realization that multi-factor authentication by itself is not a silver bullet. There are other considerations that we need to make in terms of how we have it configured and how we utilize those systems to really impact the security. Now, ideally, when an attacker tries to log into the VPN using those credentials, when they get to this screen where it's asking for a sign-in request, this should be the end of the game. The attacker should not be able to get in past this point, but we're seeing more and more attackers are finding sometimes very clever and sometimes very rudimentary ways of bypassing multi-factor authentication. And that actually brings us up to our next threat, our fourth threat on the list, and that's going to be multi-factor authentication bypass. Users with multi-factor are increasingly being targeted. Attackers know that this is a roadblock for them, and they have strategies for actually breaking through that wall now that tend to be fairly effective, and everyone should be aware of those.
For example, check out this statement from the Lapsus gang. This was part of the Uber attack. They actually came out and explained their strategy. They said, sign in with a password. Okay, because assume your password has been stolen at this point. There's billions of them out there. It will issue multi-factor authentication through a phone call or an app. However, no limit is placed on the amount of calls that can be made. Call the employee 100 times at 1 a.m. while he's trying to sleep, and he will more than likely accept it. And unfortunately, we see that all the time. I can tell you in a recent penetration test at LMG, our team found that the client was using Duo, and then just sent multiple requests to approve the sign-in, and boom, the user approved the sign-in, and they were in. So we're seeing that both in our penetration tests and also in the incidents that we're handling and the incidents that you're seeing in the news.
Yeah, I'd anticipate seeing a lot more of these attacks moving forward. It has proven itself to be an effective means for attackers to bypass multi-factor, mainly because they're just being so annoying that users click OK to stop being bothered by them. Now, if you look at the graph on the screen here, this is coming from Microsoft's tech community, and they're showing where these attacks are actually coming in. Most of these MFA fatigue attacks are coming in through either voice calls, which a lot of multi-factor authentication setups have as a fallback option, or through basic push notifications, which, as we all know, are very easy to just hit OK and forget about. And that's exactly what the attackers are kind of looking for here.
I love that annoying your users is one of the latest attacker threats and tactics. But it works. Hey,
it does. It's
every now and then when
effective.
my kids do that, I give in like, sure, fine, have the ice cream. I don't care.
Exactly. But it leads towards a change in how we put together multi-factor authentication that becomes, pretty important to have in place. The FIDO Alliance is pushing for full passwordless multi-factor and device-based authentications. As a kind of the wave of the future, which I think we will get to. It's going to take us a little while to fully implement systems like that. But in the meantime, CISA has released some guidance on using phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. And what this means basically is that there needs to be some kind of secondary positive interaction with your user before that multi-factor chain is complete. Instead of just getting a push notification, which can then be abused and used for an MFA fatigue attack, we see things like number matching being used. And you can see the example here. This is coming out of Azure's system. And with Microsoft's more advanced multi-factor authentication, once the user gets the prompt to authenticate, they also need to enter in that number they see on the screen in front of them, which greatly decreases the chance of an attacker being able to pass through that system. It's not entirely perfect.
Okay, let's be honest though. We know what the attackers are going to do. They're going to text your users and say, hey, please enter the number IMIT, please enter the number 83 into your authenticator app, right?
Yeah, so they likely will.
They will. It's not wrong. This makes me so sad. It makes me so sad because you just have to jump through all these hoops just to log in. But again, as Matt was alluding to, there is a beautiful, sunshiny, passwordless future ahead of us if only we will embrace it. Check out our video from the fall, Beyond Passwords, where we talk about the move towards passwordless authentication and how you can start taking advantage of it.
Exactly.
This is not sustainable, you guys.
It's not. Now, these kind of brute force, ham-fisted MFA fatigue attacks are not the only ways that attackers are getting in. There are some more, technologically savvy methods that attackers are using to bypass multi-factor authentication. I figured I'd touch on those here really quickly, just so you guys are aware of what's going on out there. But the theft of things like session tokens and cookies is becoming a much more common means of bypassing multi-factor authentication. If you already have a trusted browser and you've already gone through your multi-factor prompts and you're now to a point where in a lot of cases, these can last upwards of 30, 45 days, depending on the configuration. If you have yourself set up where you can just open your browser, it's on a trusted device and you can directly access your systems, attackers can now impersonate you using those keys. And if they can get their hands on them, they bypass all of those security controls that we have in place. So again, we want to be very, very careful about things like opening spam email because there could be a remote access Trojan or a piece of malware that goes after those session tokens. In fact, it's a fairly common thing that attackers will go after. Another way attackers will go after is by using basically misconfigurations inside of your multi-factor system by itself. And one that we've seen that's been very popular is the use of dormant accounts. Old users or old employees from your organization who still technically have an account inside of your network, but have not been fully removed by your IT staff yet. And it's unfortunate. We all get busy. These things get missed. It does unfortunately happen. But if an attacker can find one of those accounts, they can take that account over, register their own devices, and basically become a fully credentialed user in the network without having to trick any other users into giving up their access at that point. So again, sneaky way to bypass those controls.
So how can we proactively protect ourselves and protect liability? Well, having advanced multi-factor authentication is critical. Again, assume your passwords will be stolen. People will click on links in phishing emails. When we talk about advanced multi-factor authentication, that means don't use just text messages, don't use email, don't use phone calls. The public switch telephone network is not designed for security. Those messages and phone calls are not encrypted in transit. There is not mutual authentication. Instead, try to use an app, try to use hardware tokens, and combine that with training for your users so that they are less likely to give out things like codes or fall for those multi-factor authentication fatigue attacks. Check out our handout, Top Security Controls of 2023, for more information about using advanced multi-factor authentication. Okay, so let's get back to our case. I know, Evil Matt, you're in the front door. You've logged into the VPN using Layability's credentials. That doesn't really do you that much good, does it? You're just a low-level user. Maybe she has access to some juicy finance information, and maybe you could do some kind of like wire transfer fraud. Meh, but it really could be worse. So what's your next step? Tell us what you're going to do next in order to take over.
Yeah, so the common term for what we need to do next here is going to be land and expand. We have made our way into the network. We have secured our own account access, at least for the short term. And now we need to start figuring out where we want to go in the network. If I'm the hacker, there are a few things that I'm going to put right at the top of my list that I want to now be able to identify and potentially compromise if I'm able to. I want to go for things like your servers, your domain controller, your web servers, your application servers, anything that's going to hold either sensitive data for the network or for the organization that you're working with. I'm also going to look at things like shared folders. I want to look directly on the workstations that I can have access to. And then I want to see if I can get into those cloud services as well, because remember, we have data distributed all across our network. The more access I can get, the more probable it is that I'm going to find something juicy I can use a little bit further down the road. So the very first thing that I want to do here is just scan the network. And I don't need to be a privileged user to do this in most cases. And if I do this correctly, a lot of times security software is going to miss that this is happening, depending on how I time it and how aggressive I get.
Which is crazy, because you shouldn't be able to run scanning tools on a normal finance clerk's computer. This is, again, where you can be tracking identities. What should people be able to do? And just limit this, right?
Exactly.
I mean, how would you have prevented yourself, Evil Matt, from scanning?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways you can go about doing that. One, you can tune your internal intrusion detection systems and your EDR software to spot this kind of behavior and block that behavior from occurring in the first place. Because remember, we're not using malware here, and you'll see this as a common theme. We're going to do this without really using any traditional viruses to get into the system. What we're looking at here is that behavior. So if you have tuned security software that can spot something like port scans going and block those, you have now greatly decreased the chance of someone finding something juicy on the network. The other thing you can do is restrict users' ability to have access to things like PowerShell or to any of the other command line based tools that we would normally see used inside of the network.
Now, Matt, were you running this from her local workstation, or were you running it from your Linux box and pivoting through?
Yeah, so right now we're pivoting into the network. So we have a device on the network that, again, if our security software is tuned correctly, we will notice as a device that has registered under a user that does not normally log in with that device. And again, we're talking about that identity management and behavioral analytical aspect here. We really want to be able to notice when something strange comes onto the network that shouldn't be there. Once we find out what's different, we can find out what we need to do to stop it. But a lot of times this gets missed, mainly because software is not tuned to actually notify anyone that this type of event has occurred. And there's some pretty simple things I'm going for here. Oh yeah, Sherri, go ahead.
You're scanning, you're rattling all the doorknobs of every computer on the network, and it looks like you found a remote desktop port open, correct?
We did, yeah. So we're looking for a couple things here. We're looking for file shares and then remote desktop, because we want to actually get onto this user's workstation. And in this case, we were able to actually identify Leah's computer by itself. Using her credentials that we already have and the access that we already have, we're able to directly log onto the desktop of her computer. And this gives us a lot more information that we didn't have access to previously. We get her local file system, we get any shared folder she has access to, we get any application she uses, her internet history, her passwords stored in the browser, and a lot more. Basically, we have compromised a good amount of information here. We'll show you how we're going to expand this in a minute, but just by itself right here, we have now caused a big problem. So again, the first thing we want to look at is what do we have on the local system by itself? Well, you can see from the examples here, we have access to any of the devices that Leah might have access to, including things like multifunction printers on the network. If you want to see exactly how this can go horribly wrong, check out our webinar from a couple months back with Tom Pohl. Does a great job illustrating exactly how access to something as simple as that Konica Minolta on the network can lead to a full account takeover. There are other things too. We have the local file system, so any sensitive data that's being held in the user's local repository. We have their OneDrive that we now don't have to authenticate against because this is a trusted device, and a lot more. Now, looking at the shared folder specifically, this is a fairly common thing we find when we're doing penetration tests, and that is a low-privileged user who just has access to shared folders on the network that they probably don't need to have access to. By itself, this is probably not a huge deal, but if we have access to something like that backups folder, that means I could potentially get in, pull configurations from your backups, pull credentials that are for higher privileged users, and move farther into the network. Very, very common attack strategy.
Oh yeah, let's time out for a second. You're probably thinking to yourselves, low-level users on my network don't have access to the backups. And I would recommend you double check that, because we've seen so many cases where everybody thinks that's true until somebody gets an account taken over, and then you discover, whoops, the permissions were set incorrectly. So be really careful and double check and make sure that you're securing backups, because those have a lot of sensitive information in them.
Exactly. One of the other things that we have access to is the password vault that this user now relies on to maintain all their passwords. Remember, we've been talking for a while now about using a password manager instead of something like an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document, and that advice still stands. But we need to be clear about this. If someone gains access to the computer that the user normally uses and can gain access to something like a browser with a LastPass add-on that's already been signed in, now the attacker can go in and pull those passwords out. This goes the same for anything that's stored directly in Chrome or Edge or Firefox or Safari or any of the other big browsers. All of them are vulnerable to this. And a lot of automated malware will go after these repositories right away when it hits a network. It will exfiltrate those credentials and make sure that it compromises as many accounts as it possibly can. So again, keep an eye on that one. The other thing we can do is leverage trusted devices, and we hinted at this a little bit earlier, but if we are looking at services that traditionally require things like an MFA trigger, like logging into your email or your SharePoint or something like that, this can be bypassed by gaining access to the user's computer and just using the applications that user already has installed. If we've got Outlook already on the computer and we just open it, well, we're into the email. There's usually not a secondary sign-on, or at least not one that happens very frequently using those applications. I mean, we can time it so that there is an additional MFA trigger every 10 days, 5 days, something like that. But in a lot of cases, we see those controls not enabled. People are able to just pop in, gain access to whatever they want to, because again, this is their trusted device and it's how they normally access those systems. The last thing we want to do is establish persistent access to Leah's workstation. And this is a major trend that we're seeing from attackers. It's really been going for about the last 2 years now. And prior to that, it was kind of old hat, but it's the use of non-malicious software to complete malicious tasks. In this case, we want persistent access to Leah's workstation, but we know that an MFA fatigue attack is not going to work every single time we try to hit the user with it. So what do? Well, it's easy. We just install our own remote monitoring and management utility, and that way we have persistent access. We're just going to throw AnyDesk on there. And again, this is hugely common, especially when we talk about things like ransomware cases. In almost every ransomware case we do, we see one of these utilities in place.
And it's not going to be detected necessarily by antivirus software, because AnyDesk is really common remote access software that is used legitimately as well. So that is just a huge trend that we've been seeing.
Exactly.
And Matt, you're right. Often at this point, we see victims getting hit with ransomware. So good time to mention that we have a ransomware response class coming up. I'm so excited. It is a brand new class that's designed to go with the brand new book. It's online one day, so check it out. We'd love to see you in class.
All right, so let's take a quick time out here. We had some opportunities to detect things going wrong inside of HackMe's network that were missed in this case. Now, remember, me as the attacker, I have not used anything that would trip signature-based antivirus software, and I've also done this in a way that a lot of intrusion detection systems or EDR systems may not automatically catch. So where could we have been discovered during this entire process, up to this point anyway? Well, there was that initial VPN access. If I come in at a strange time from a strange IP address using a strange device or something like that, this is something that can be tracked and can be tagged as an element that needs follow-up from security staff. We can also, in some cases, automatically cut off that device's access if we have our orchestration and automation playbooks in place, something that we'll get into in future webinars. We also have that network scanning element. If we see something like a ping sweep going out across the network, that should be a red flag right there.
Plus, network segmentation, preventing people from preventing a low-level user from even being able to scan another part of the network is key.
Exactly. And then the other things really come down to things like behavioral detections. These are things that, again, aren't tripping antivirus software, but look outside the norm on networks. So we have remote access weird times, a user who doesn't normally use PowerShell, now suddenly using PowerShell, local administrator account usage, software installations. There's a lot that we can key on here. But again, we need to be tooled to be able to detect those things. One of the ways that we can really kind of crank down the security of our users is through the use of an appropriate identity and access management solution. We have a couple up on the screen here. Azure's Active Directory system is wildly popular, is used by a lot of organizations. The same with the Amazon Web Services identity and access management system. These are really important to have in place. And for a few different reasons. One, you can use them to really easily restrict access to accounts. And this can also be used to provision and deprovision users quickly in the event that you need to get an account either on or off of your system. You can also use data from this to see if an account is being used inappropriately or misused in some way. And we can automate response using these tools. We can have automatic scripts built in that if we see some kind of strange or unexpected behavior, we can either send additional challenges to that account using a conditional access policy, or we can just cut the account off completely until IT is able to get in and verify that it's being used by the authorized user.
So let's get back to our case. Matt, I love how you took over this organization because you didn't actually end up having to take over an admin's account, right? Do you want to walk through this?
That's exactly what we did. So we identified a very common misconfiguration of the domain controller inside of the HackMe network. And again, this gets discovered on pen tests very, very frequently. There is a simple misconfiguration of what's referred to as the certificate authority that is controlled usually by the domain controller that can allow us to essentially steal the identity of another user on the network without having to know much about that user aside from what their account is. And it is usually pretty solid that we're going to find an administrator account by that name on a system. So in this case, that's exactly what we're doing here. We are stealing the certificate that the administrator account would normally use to authenticate, and we're going to use it to authenticate ourselves, meaning we are now the administrator at this point.
So in plain English, instead of trying to take over an admin's account, you made Leah an administrator.
Exactly.
All of a sudden, she has elevated privileges. And you only were able to do that because there was a very common misconfiguration in the domain controller, which my understanding is that that is the default configuration, right, Matt?
Yeah, it's a default template for the certificate authority. It's very easy to fix, but a lot of times it gets overlooked because it's way far down on the priority list for IT staff.
Yeah, the devil's in the details. So you just requested a certificate with administrator's name, then you could pass the ticket and authenticate as a privileged user. If you have any questions about the details of this attack, feel free to drop either of us a line on LinkedIn and we can fill you in on and give you some more information. And this is something that automated security software may well not detect. I mean, remember, we are not using malware to do this, right, Matt? Were you just using PowerShell?
Yeah, this is just PowerShell at this point.
Yeah. Okay, so we didn't need that guy. We didn't actually need to take over the database administrator's account. Sorry, dude.
Yeah, sorry, Vic. We'll get you next time.
So now with admin privileges, evil Leah ended up taking over the file server. Let's walk through some of the details.
Yeah, so the screenshot you see here is us attempting with our regular access as Leah, attempting to access the company information shared folder that we could see on the network, but couldn't get into. And you can see the error message that pops up. Windows couldn't access the folder because we as that user did not have permissions to access. Now we're the administrator, though, so we can access whatever we want to. We have the keys to the kingdom, and you can see we go right through the door, and now we're into that inventory folder, and we have access to all of the data that was available to us at that point. The other thing we can do is take over the domain controller, which means we now have full control of everything on the network. We can set up new group policies, we can disable security software, we can change permissions, we can open up access. There's a lot that we can do here. Again, these are elements that are, unless you know exactly where to look for them, going to be kind of hard to detect when they've been changed. So something we want to watch out for. And as we've hammered on before, in a lot of ransomware cases, this is where we see the priming stage kind of take place. This is where adversaries will kind of massage a network into a configuration that allows them to do things like deploy ransomware and steal files from the system. So let's talk about stealing files from the system. How would we go about doing that? Well, again, we are trying to not trip antivirus software or security software, so we're going to use a regular utility. We're going to use a utility called rclone. This is very commonly used to steal data in ransomware cases. In fact, I'm working on a case right now where this looks like it was the utility used to steal data. And yeah, all we have to do is drop this on the system, point it towards those shared folders, and now we can pipe this directly out to whatever file repository we want to. In this case, we're using Mega, but this can also go out to Dropbox or GitHub or Google Drive or really anywhere else. And again, if we use one of those more commonly associated services like Dropbox, there's a good chance that's not going to get blocked at the firewall. So we can just kind of sneak out with everything that we have access to.
Great. I'm going to use this as a little opportunity to plug reducing your data. Remember, often victims don't discover the full extent of data that they have until the attacker is explaining it to them. In case after case, we see cyber extortionists telling victims, I have this list of information, and the victims didn't even realize that they had that data. So make sure that you are reducing your data. The less information you store, the less risk you have. And also, it's less storage space. It's less work to maintain. So that is the number one cheapest way to reduce your risk of data breach, is to reduce your data, less to steal. And in order to do that, you have to do data discovery and data mapping, a really important top security control for 2023. So make sure that you're effectively identifying sensitive data. You're looking at both your local network and your cloud. This is an iterative process. You might start with a simple spreadsheet and then continue on and start to use automated tools and really refine this over time. On this slide, we've included an example of OneTrust's data mapping software. There's plenty of other data mapping software out there. This is just one example of a tool that you can use. All right, Matt, thank you so much for stepping us through that attack. I love how you just totally took over. Again, we didn't even need to take over an IT administrator's account. You just phished a user and then tricked the system into thinking she was an administrator and ended up totally owning the whole network. So very impressive. Nice work. Let's talk about our fifth and final threat, rookie hackers. Used to be the case that hackers without a ton of technical skill were a bit limited. Now, inexperienced hackers actually have access to military-grade cyber weapons, literally, because we have seen so many cyber weapons leaked over the past few years. So, Matt, why don't you take it away and show us some of what you're seeing out there on the dark web?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we've seen in the dark web recently has been a big rise in the amount of malware or malware as a service offerings that are being put out there for sale. And this is basically opening the door for hackers who do not have a high level of technical sophistication to get their hands on these very valuable, very powerful, and sometimes very destructive pieces of malware. The Eternity Project is a great example of this. This is a malware as a service offering that works on a subscription model. So the same way that you would license Microsoft's Office 365 system or Google Workspace or something along those lines, you can now license access to malicious software, and your fee will depend on what exact kind of malware you want. Do you want an information stealer? Do you want a crypto miner? Do you want ransomware? All of these are available for sale, and they are available at just literally the click of a button. This is the advertisement from the Eternity Project for their ransomware. And they give you a nice little description of what ransomware is. They talk about what makes theirs unique. This will function offline. This doesn't require a network connection. It uses very strong encryption that in most cases cannot be broken. And it's $470 if you want access to the system. This
Don't
also
get
means,
any ideas, you guys. Don't get any
exactly.
ideas.
let's not have that be the outcome of this. But similar to how we were talking about earlier with software suppliers and vendors that you work with, one of the guarantees that we get from these malware as a service offerings is they will handle things like software updates and patches for you. Yes, patches and software updates for your malware. That's a thing. They will also do a custom malware for you if it's something that you need. And they offer almost a referral program. If you have somebody else who is going to also be buying malware, they will give you a discount on your next purchase. Again, incredibly popular offerings on darknet marketplaces, and it has really opened the door for a lot of people who normally wouldn't have the wherewithal to hack networks or to have access to these tools to go out and wreak untold amounts of damage just because they don't really know how to use these things.
We also see inexperienced hackers signing up to be franchisees, essentially affiliates of ransomware as a service groups or other cyber criminal gangs. And sometimes this can go terribly wrong. One example of this is Lockbit. Lockbit has an affiliate program, and in December, one of their affiliates broke their rules, hacked a hospital, sick kids in Canada, encrypted their data, took over, and Lockbit actually stepped in and said, whoa, 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 we apologize for the attack on this hospital and give back the decryptor for free. The partner who attacked this hospital violated our rules, is blocked, and is no longer in our affiliate program. So, I mean, come on, criminals have standards too, right? And again, unfortunately, not everybody understands the rules. We're also seeing criminals like Lockbit trying to crowdsource, they're looking for gig workers. Matt, why don't you tell us what you found?
Yeah, so this is coming off of Lockbit's blog on their dark web portal, and what we found is that they're actually actively asking for public input or independent contractors to come and work with them to see if they can do things like identify bugs in their software, or if they're able to identify one of the Lockbit affiliate managers and dox their location, provide verification that they know who they are. They will pay you $1 million reward. Or if you just have a brilliant idea about how they can run their ransomware operation better, they may pay you for that. I mean, they're really looking for basically consultants at this point, which is an interesting turn that we haven't really seen before with ransomware operators.
All right, those are the top threats of 2023. We started with technology supply chain attacks. Then we went into software API abuse, identity abuse, multi-factor authentication flaws and bypass attacks, and finally, rookie hackers that have access to military-grade cyber weapons. There are ways that you can defend against this, and things to prioritize this year include monitoring and patching your attack surface. Continuous vulnerability scanning has never been more important. Conducting penetration testing so that you're detecting issues that automated tools cannot necessarily find. Conducting cloud configuration reviews. Many of us have moved our data and our critical infrastructure into the cloud, and you need to be testing that the same way we used to test our on-prem installations. Make sure you're managing your supplier risks. You are prioritizing vetting suppliers, routinely monitoring their security levels as well. Invest in employee awareness training, particularly when it comes to clicking on links in phishing emails and use of authentication techniques. Use advanced multi-factor authentication. Check out our handout, The Top Security Controls of 2023, for an in-depth discussion on that. Make sure you're using identity and access management solutions, IAM solutions, to really pull it all together and make sure you're protecting against some of these really fundamental issues that hackers are taking advantage of. Conduct data discovery and data mapping and reduce your data. When you reduce your data, you automatically reduce your risk. With that, I am Sherri Davidoff. This is Matt Durring from LMG Security. We do have a ransomware response class coming up, so check that out. Hope to see some of you in class. It is all new, brand shiny new material. And with that, I will turn it back to our moderator for questions.
Thank you, Sherri and Matt. We did have a few questions that came from our audience during the presentation. The first question was, should I be using cloud services instead of hosting my own?
This is a great question, and a lot of people are struggling with this right now. I know many, especially highly regulated organizations, were hesitant to move to the cloud and really have now fully embraced it. There's pros and cons either way, but in a lot of cases, taking advantage of cloud hosting, especially things like Microsoft 365 that are actually hosted by the developers, can really reduce your information security burden and reduce your risk of having an active vulnerability that hackers could exploit.
Thank you, Sherri. The second question was, if my data is hacked while it's in the cloud, can cyber insurance cover any damages?
That is a very complicated question, and it's something you'll want to talk to your insurance agent about. We are seeing a trend of cyber insurers starting to address these issues of attacks and breaches that happen because of third-party suppliers. And in some cases, you may have coverage unless it's a certain provider. Like if Amazon goes down or Microsoft services go down or are hacked, you may have coverage excluded because of that. We're also seeing other cyber insurers excluding coverage in cases where there is a widespread event. So if enough people get hacked, you don't have coverage. So make sure you really understand how your policy is addressing these issues for services that you rely on. And let us know if you have any questions.
Great, thank you. Our final question was, how can I confirm that my systems aren't vulnerable?
That's a great question. So there are a few different ways that you can confirm whether or not you have a vulnerability that exists on your system. One of those is going to be the use of an automated scanning tool, something like Nessus or like Tenable's automated scanners are great at rooting out some of those more common vulnerabilities. The other way is going to be going through penetration tests. Actually get a white hat inside your network who can go through and test to see whether or not you are vulnerable or are properly patched against some of the more common vulnerabilities and see if they're able to break through and actually exploit those systems. The big thing is you want to be doing this frequently, though. This is not something that you want to do, every 6 months or every year or something along those lines. Vulnerabilities get released so frequently anymore that we really need to have an almost constant vulnerability scan going on, which is possible with some tools, but is definitely something you should look at.
Thank you, Matt and Sherri. Once again, this is Tamara with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended. Please take a moment to fill out the survey afterwards and let us know what you thought. The recorded video from this presentation and handouts will be made available to attendees, and we will send out a notification once live. Thank you and have a good day.